Amen. Did anybody have any questions on anything that we've said so far? No? Okay. So when we looked at Daniel 2, we saw how we can make, in a very simple way, there are many ways to address this issue. But in Daniel 2, it seems to me, when we look at those verses, that it's very straightforward to show in verse 39, we looked at verse 39, when it deals with the third kingdom, the last part of the verse, to say that the third kingdom would bear rule over all the earth. And we picked up that phrase about bearing rule and the whole earth, and we saw how at the end of the world we can apply that to the United Nations. Then when we went to Daniel 7, verse 5, we saw how when it comes to the second kingdom, this bear that was lopsided, indicating that there's some unbalance there, which we understand is this symbology that's being brought to view about this two-horned power, this nation that's comprised of two elements, the Medes and the Persians. And we saw how we could identify that these three ribs that were in its mouth, that we have the symbol of a mouth, we have a symbol of ribs, how we could get those ribs and see that they were a symbol of a woman, of Eve, how we could see that a woman is a symbol of a church, so that this bear has taken control of three religious elements in its mouth. So we can see all of that symbology in Daniel chapter 7, verse 5, and an end-time application of that would be this two-horned power, the Medes and the Persians representing the United States, having its mouth open, indicating that it has the ability to speak, with these three religious elements in its mouth, which is the threefold union at the end of the world. Spiritualism, Catholicism and Protestantism at the Sunday law, because this mouth is open with the ability to speak. And we're now into Daniel chapter 8, and we looked at verses 1 and 2, and I gave some preamble about my lack of understanding of why Babylon was not brought to view in these verses. It starts with the Medes and Persians, and I gave my understanding of why that was. I've erased it off the board. How the repeat and enlarge from verses from chapters 2, 7 till 8 are dealing with what's going to happen in the latter times. So it's talking about what's happening at the end of the world, and particularly in Daniel chapter 7, when we looked at verses 7 and 8, we saw this fourth kingdom, this fourth beast, this iron beast, which had 10 horns in its head, and then another little horn sprung up after it, and before whom 3 of the horns were plucked up. So we have this fourth beast with 7 horns and another little horn in its head. And I made the suggestion that because the horns are in its head, it's part of the same system, part of the same kingdom. And we could see that in Daniel chapter 2. Because in Daniel chapter 2 you have the legs all of iron, the feet of iron and clay. And you see this single material that's running through the legs into the feet, showing that there's some continuum, even though there's a different element that's introduced into the feet. And Daniel 7 is going to try and portray the same sentiment, but it's going to use the fact that the horns are in the head of this fourth beast. And then we made an application and saw that when the little horn rose to power in 538, where it would speak words against the Most High, that both the 7 horns and the fourth beast are still in existence in that time period. And not only are they in existence, they help and support this little horn in its activities. We saw that the fourth beast was not a natural animal, indicating that whatever is being described here is something that's not part of nature. And what's not part of nature is brought to view again in Daniel chapter 8, and it's this alliance between the little horn and this fourth beast. Pagan and papal Rome, when they join together in this relationship, which is an unholy alliance, it's a transgression. We see that brought to view in the symbology of Daniel chapter 7. But the thing that we picked up in Daniel 7 was that in the time period of the 1260, 538 to 1798, you had these three powers. You had pagan Rome, or the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, and you had the seven horns of Western Europe, and you had the papacy, all three coexisting and supporting one another. And this is the threefold union. This is the prototype of the threefold union that we maybe even unwittingly make an end-time application of. Because most people, when they talk about the threefold union, they go to Revelation 17 or Revelation 13 or 16, the dragon, the beast and the false prophet. Sometimes we don't appreciate that this is just an end-time application of the 1260 itself. Just as we mentioned before in Daniel 2, how you can apply that at the end of the world. Daniel 7 verse 5, that bear. It's the same with the threefold union. The threefold union is nothing more than an end-time application of a historical alliance that's well documented, but we don't sometimes appreciate that. So in Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, we'll read that again. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And that vision that's appeared unto him at the first is the vision of Daniel chapter 7. Verse 2, and I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. I've already mentioned that this is the third year of Belshazzar, and the third year is his last year of his reign. So we're in the last year of the reign of Belshazzar, and verse 2 says that Daniel was in the palace which is at Shushan, which is in the province of Elam. Now, just before the Medes and the Persians come and take the city of Babylon, they're going through the country or the nation of Babylon, taking city after city. And Shushan, which is in the province of Elam, when Babylon was ruling the world, was a part of the Babylonian Empire. Now, at some stage in this conquest, the Medes and the Persians took Shushan captive in their progressive march towards Babylon. Many commentators, when they look at verse 2, they think that Daniel, because Shushan was part of the Babylonian Empire, in the final year that he was there on some kind of business. But that really isn't what's being portrayed here. We know that Shushan was part of the Babylonian Empire, but there was not a palace there in the time when the Babylonians were ruling. This palace that was built up in the city of Shushan was the activity or the work of the Persian Empire. By the time you've got to the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, the end of Babylon, the Medes and Persians, who were a two-horned power, had originally started with the Medes, and the Medes were in the ascendancy. They joined forces with the Persians through intermarriage, and gradually but surely the Persians began to take control of the situation. And by the time Cyrus came on the scene, it was actually prophesied that Cyrus would do this work of taking over the empire from the Medes, and at his birth, they attempted to kill him, but providentially, he escaped that. Was brought up by some shepherd people in the back countries, and eventually his father repented of this and brought him back into the family. And eventually, this prophecy was fulfilled, and he did actually take over the whole nation and became in the ascendancy. So by the time we've got to verse 1, the Persians are already in the ascendancy, and this is the work of Cyrus, who's already done this. But Shushan is not does not have a palace at this juncture. In fact, the palace begins to get constructed under the reign of Darius. It's under the reign of Darius that the palace is brought to view. And this isn't the Darius that's brought, it's been chapter 5. It's not Darius the Mede. This is Darius who issues the second decree. This is Darius who issues the second decree. So you have Cyrus, Cambyses, Philsmodus, and then Darius. Darius is this fourth king, and it's under his reign that the palace at Shushan is being constructed, being built, and he's the one who made it into a palace city. So that's one of the first clues that we have, that in verse 2, when it says that Daniel was in Shushan in the palace, that he's not talking about a historical event that's here in the last or third year of Belshazzar, at the very end of the Babylonian Empire. It's not talking about that time period there. So we can establish that historically. So that only leads us to the conclusion that what's actually happening is, when Daniel is having this vision of chapter 8, he's actually taken in vision in the palace at Shushan. So he's not bodily there, he's in vision in the palace. So this vision doesn't begin in the third year here, it begins at some time later on. At least that's what verse 2 is going to indicate to us, because he's in the palace at Shushan, and there is no palace there in the time period when Belshazzar is reigning. So that's the first thing we want to understand. The second thing is, because of the locality of the Middle East where the Medes and Persians were ruling, they would spend part of the year in one palace city, and they'd spend another part of the year in another palace city. There were some places that were too hot during the summer, and there were some places that were too cold during the winter, so they'd move the capital from one place to another. And Shushan was a winter palace. So Shushan was a winter palace. That's winter as we understand it, from November, December into January, February. So the other thing that we know is that Shushan was a winter palace. So all these are historical facts. So we have some other clues about what's going on here, because the term Shushan the palace is brought to view in two other books. Most of us are already familiar with this because it's in the public record. The first book is in the book of Esther, and the other book is in the book of Nehemiah. So they're the two books that the Shushan the palace is brought to view in. So it's an understanding of those two books and how the palace is brought to view there that we can begin to understand how to locate this in time, in an end time application. So we're going to just have a quick look at that. So the easiest one to really look at this is in the book of Nehemiah. So let's turn to the book of Nehemiah. So as you're turning there, just to summarize, Shushan the palace, this phrase is only going to be found in 3 books of the Bible. One in the book of Esther, one in the book of Nehemiah, and here in Daniel chapter 8. And it's my contention, based upon the fact that it identifies a palace being in Shushan, that this verse 2 is not in the time period of Belshazzar, it's in a future time period, right into the future here, because we know two things. First of all, that it's a winter palace, and the second thing, it's the fourth king that has any significance to us, Darius the Great, who actually is the king who builds up this city and establishes a palace there. So if Daniel is in the palace at Shushan, we know that it has to be after Darius the Great is ruling. So maybe we're not overly familiar with the kings of Persia without writing all the names, because we're fairly familiar with them. I'll just put the first letters. This is Cyrus, and this is Darius. This is not Darius the Mede, this is Darius the Great. Darius the Mede is back here. And this is Artaxerxes. And these are the kings who make the first, second, and third decree that most of us are familiar with. And there are two kings in between them. So we have a total of 7 kings. And we know that it's this king here that makes the palace in Shushan. So wherever Daniel chapter 8 verse 2 is, we know it's back here. But the third year of Belshazzar is 2 years before Cyrus is reigning, in the reign of Darius the Mede. So this is the third year of Belshazzar. By the time you've got to here, Daniel has died already. He's an aged man here. So we know that when he's in the palace at Shushan, he must be in vision. The king that's brought to view here is Xerxes. I think it's, no, I've not spelled that correct. Is that correct? Sorry, another one? Yeah, that's better. And this is the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther that we're familiar with. But this is Xerxes. That's how most of the secular world know him, but the Bible calls him Ahasuerus. So if you're familiar with major battles, this is the king that engages in the Battle of Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans. This is that history there. So here's the 5th king there. Any questions? Or is that pretty straightforward? So we're in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 1, verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hachaliah. And it came to pass in the month Chislew, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace. I assume most of us here are familiar that the calendation that we follow, the whole world follows now, is a Roman calendar that we follow. And it was instigated by a pope, Pope Gregory. And a kind of a term that we use is we use a Gregorian calendar. It comes from the name of this pope, Pope Gregory. And it's a Roman calendar that we follow, that we begin our year in January. Now, we understand that the Jews reckon their year differently. They reckon the beginning of the year in the spring, not in the winter. And the way they ran their calendar was not a fixed calendar in the way that we understand a fixed calendar. It was a combination of the movements of the sun, of the moon, and also of the harvest that were in the land. So depending upon the combination of those three elements, the sun, the moon, and the harvest, they would determine the start of the year. So it would vary quite a bit. It could vary plus or minus 30 days in any given year, unlike our calendar, which is at a fixed point in time in relation to the movements of the sun. So a Hebrew calendar begins in the spring, most of the time in around April. And so that would be the first month of the year. So verse 1 says, "And it came to pass in the month Chislev." Now the month Chislev, if you looked it up, would be the 9th month. This is the 9th month of the year. And if you were to begin around April and counted 9 months, it would take you to around December. So you'd have April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. The 9th month would be around December, which is in the winter. So he's in the palace in winter time, which prophetically here, or his, Bible history, fits in with a secular understanding, secular history of understanding that this was a winter palace. So those two thoughts connect together. And it says this is in the 20th year. So this is the 20th year in the context of the book of Nehemiah. This is the 20th year of this king. King Artaxerxes in the 20th year. Now, different nations would begin their calendars at different times of the year. Everybody knows what the solstice is, the spring and autumn solstice, not the solstice, the equinox, sorry, I shouldn't put it's not the solstice, it's the equinox. Solstice is a different thing. Does everybody understand what the equinox is? The equinox is when everybody knows one day is 24 hours. And unless you live on the equator, if you live off the equator like most of the world does, over the year, the length of a day and the length of a night vary. So in summer, the days are long and the nights are short, and in winter it's the opposite. And the equinox is where the day and the night are both exactly 12 hours long. So when you have 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, and you get this occurring twice a year, once in the spring and once in the autumn. And this is part of the system that the Hebrews used to calculate the beginning of their year. It's not exactly to do with the equinox, but they factored that in. They had some extra components to it. And most of the empires of the world at that time ran all of their calendars from either the sun or a combination of the sun and the moon. The Hebrews would begin in the spring, and most other nations would begin in the autumn. So when it says here, we're in the 9th month in the 20th year, and we're in the winter in December time. So if I do a little calendar here, this is January to December. This is our time. The Jews would begin their year here. This is the spring. And then this was the autumn. I'll put the others like that. And we're here in December. So the 20th year of this king, Artaxerxes, would have begun around this kind of time here. So this would be the beginning of the year in the term of the 20th year of this king. And we're going to see why that's important in a moment. And so this here would be the 20th year. Have I lost anybody so far? Does that all make sense? Yeah? Okay. Sorry, I didn't. Everything okay? Yeah? Okay. So, December is the 9th month. Now, I'm not saying the 9th month isn't significant, but I don't know anybody who's got any prophetic understanding at this moment about the 9th month. So I don't have any clarity on that. But we're trying to locate Daniel chapter 8, verse 2, with an end-time application. So let's go to chapter 2. So now we're in chapter 2 of Nehemiah. And it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. And now I had not been before sad in his presence. So let's try and lay this out. We're still in the 20th year of the king. So let's run this through a bit further. So that was December, and then we're going to go into January, and then we're going to come back into December. Okay, so I've got 2 Gregorian years, and here's Jews, and here's others. But we're still in the 20th year. So his 20th year is going to end here. Does that make sense? Chapter 1, verse 1 is this point here. This chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1 says this. And it came to pass in the month Nisan. Now the month Nisan is the first year of the month. Sorry, the first month of the year. The first month of the year. Now if we were going to run purely on Hebrew time, so if we were going to run on Hebrew time, this would be the first day of the first month. Yeah? And when I get to the next year, when I go to the first month in the following year, it's going to be another whole new year, isn't it? Yeah? So if I were to go here, I'd have the first day of the first month. And this would be year 1. And then this would be year 2. Does that make sense? Yeah, if I'm working on a Jewish time, by the time I've got to chapter 2, verse 1, I'm in Nisan. Yeah? So if I'm in Nisan, then I'm in the second year, I'm in another year. But it says we're still in the 20th year of the king. We're still in the same year. So what's being brought to view here, there are 2 calendars that are being combined. There are 2 calendars. There's the calendar of the Medes and the Persians, the others, and there's a calendar of the Jews that are being superimposed one upon the other. If we were going to be using the Jewish calendar only, this would be a totally separate year. So if the Medes and Persians were going to use the same calendar as the Jews, and we're here, because we're in the 9th month, this is what year? This is the 20th year. So this would be the 20th year, because we're right here in the 20th year. The 20th year is this far, and here's where chapter 1, verse 1 is. This is in the 20th year. By the time you got to Nisan, you'd be in the 21st year. But chapter 2, verse 1 tells you what? That you're still in the same year. So because you know you're in the same year, you know that even though it's not explicitly saying it, it's implicitly telling you that you're getting 2 calendars joined together. you're getting one calendar here, which is the calendar of the Medes and Persians, which is out of phase with the calendar of the Jews. We've got two calendars that are out of phase by around 6 months. They're out of phase by 6 months. And that is really significant because it says in one period, in 1 year, you've got an event that's occurring right here. Why here? Because this is chapter 2, verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1, this is Nisan. Yeah? And here is chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. And there's about 4 months separating these. Thereabouts 4 months. Because this is the 9th month and this is the 1st. You go 9, 10, 11, 12, and then you're in the 13th month, which will be the 1st. So you've got 4 months separating that time period. So the difference between chapter 1 and chapter 2 is a 4-month period, but it's all contained in a singular month. It's in the same month. Does that make sense? Same year, sorry, the same year. Does that make sense? So this is where you sort of play a bit of mental gymnastics, and all of that is defendable. That's all straightforward. And now when you start making some application, people begin to get nervous, especially people who are opposed to this message. Because now we're going to make some application, and they said, okay, it's all okay up to here, but now when you make the next step, then you're stepping too far. Because what we're going to do is we're going to turn these dates and numbers into symbols. So when we do that, we're going to say in this singular year, we've got 2 separate months. We've got this one and this one. And because they're both happening in the same year, when you take it as a symbol, you can get those 2 events and you can superimpose them one on top of the other. So what we know is that chapter 1, verse 1, there's some information that's here. And chapter 2, not only from verse 1, but through the chapter, there's some other characteristics that we can identify. And if we take these not as time, but as symbols occurring at the same time because they're occurring in the same year, we can get these and we can superimpose them one on top of the other. And the reason why we'd want to do that is because chapter 1, verse 1 is talking about Shushan the palace. So we can get that symbol of Shushan the palace and bring it into Daniel chapter 8. Or take Daniel chapter 8 and bring it into here, however way you want to see that. And that's happening in the 9th month, which doesn't really mean much to us, does it? But when we see that all of this is happening at the same year, at the same time, Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1 is happening where? In the 1st month. And that puts some lights on for us because we know that the 1st month does mean something to us. Is there anybody who doesn't know what implications the 1st month means to us? Because I can quickly explain it. It's not hard to explain. Everybody familiar with it? Or should I just run through it quickly? Okay, I'll run through it quickly. So let's erase this. I'm assuming that we're fairly familiar with Millerite history. You don't have to have a detailed understanding of it. So Millerite history would run from 1798 to 1844. And this would be October. And this would be April 1844. We can put the date or the day. Remember we said that the Jews began their year in the spring, but we begin our year in the winter in January. So Gregorian calendar and the Jewish calendar are out of sync by about 4 months. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4. But they're out of sync on average by about 4 months. Does that make sense? Now, we've just seen here that we're combining the calendar for the Medes and Persians and the calendar for the Jews together. They're being merged together. And an understanding of that gives us the ability to get these two things and see that they're happening they're happening at the same event. They're two waymarks that we can superimpose one on top of the other. I don't think the Millerites were aware of this, but what the Millerites were aware of is that they needed to combine calendars as well. So they had to combine the Gregorian calendar, the calendar that you and I live in, that the Millerites lived in, and they combined that with the Jewish calendar. So when they were running their prophecies, and primarily we're thinking about Daniel 8:14, the 2300-day prophecy, and we see that they talk about it ending in the year 1843. Everybody's familiar with that they thought about 1843. Often when we hear that, without realizing it, we think this. If this is 1843 and this is 1844, this would be January, December, January, December. And a superficial understanding, you would think that the Millerites would think, when you get to here, which would be December the 31st, 1843, that this would be the end of their prophecy. And that when you got to the 1st of January 1844, then their time has run out. But that's not what they thought, and they never thought that. They knew that when they were thinking about 1843, they would combine that with a Jewish calendar. And so a Jewish calendar would begin and end in the spring. So when they were thinking about when 1843 ended, they'd be thinking about this point, not this point. So initially they thought that this point was going to be in the March, but they realized it was going to be in the April. And so here would be April. Now April is the 4th month in our calendar, but in the Jewish calendar it's what month? It'd be the 1st month. This is the 1st month. So here's the 1st month. And all you would need to do is look how the Jews calculated their years, and you could work out what the first day would be in the Jewish calendar. And it turns out that the first day of the 1st month would be the 19th of April. So here we have the first day of the 1st month. And it turns out to be the 19th of April, 1844, because here you can see we're in 1844, but the way the Millerites were processing their information, they said that 1843 went up to this point here. So they're combining two calendars. They're combining a Gregorian calendar with a Hebrew calendar. And all they've done is this. They've used all the same terminology, all these months, days, and years, as we understand them, but they've just shifted the start of the year. So that's how they've combined them together. So when they were talking about 1843, that Christ was going to come, it could have come all the way up to the spring of 1844. So by the time you get to the 19th of April, you're now in the beginning of a new year. So this is the first day of the 1st month, which is the 19th of April, 1844. And this idea here of the first day of the 1st month is really significant. This 22nd of October 1844, we will understand that that's the Day of Atonement. And because it's the Day of Atonement, it's a feast day. And when you go through the Bible, it tells you what day that's going to be. And it's going to tell you that it's going to be on the 10th day of the 7th month. And we're all familiar with that. And as soon as you start seeing that, you can begin to put in other dates into this history. And one of the most important ones that we understand now is the first day of the 5th month. And again, that equates to an event in the Millerite history, which we understand is the midnight cry. So what we can do is we can take these dates and we can use them as symbols. And when you use them as symbols, you can then identify events that are occurring in the scriptures at these particular dates with historical events in Millerite history. So, for instance, if you went to a Bible passage and it spoke about the first day of the fifth month, this isn't a particularly good example because there's only one of them that addresses this date, it would identify that that story was related to this waymark at the midnight cry. And you could do the same with the first day of the first month. So, did that all make sense? When you get to this date here, April the 19th, 1844, a number of things happen in Millerite history. And the primary one is that the Millerites have run out of time and they're disappointed because they've got no more time to calculate to take you to any other event, and nothing has happened. Christ hasn't come, they've not gone to heaven. And there's an intense struggle that has now escalated between the Millerites and the Protestants to the degree that there is severe conflict going on. And the Millerites recognize and realize that the Protestants have now become Babylon because of the way they're addressing the message and the way they're dealing with the Millerites. So they've now become part of Babylon, and they start expressing that. And so we can see that at this point here, the second angel's message arrives, because the second angel's message is the announcement that Babylon has fallen, and the Millerites identified the Protestant churches as being Babylon. So when you understand this truth, that the 19th of April, which was caused by a mistake on the chart, which is in the spring of the year, relates to the first day of the first month. And the first day of the first month is then connected to the second angel's message. And we can take the first day of the first month, and we can, in many different Bible stories, and then we can relate that to the second angel's message, its arrival. But there's more to this story than that. Most of us are familiar with this. That this was 1843, but if we went further back into this timeline, and we put the date 1840 here, month August, so the 11th of August 1840, we understand here that the first angel's message didn't arrive, but it was empowered. And this empowerment of the first angel's message was brought about by a restraining of radical Islam. Radical Islam was restrained at this date here. The nation of Egypt was restrained from interposing and interfering and making war against Turkey by the powers of Europe, and the restraint that they placed upon Egypt had significant ramifications in the geopolitical events that were going on in that time period. So this restraining of Islam was an important event in that history, and we know that we can bring this into our own history today when we see that radical Islam was again restrained at 9/11. Without going too much into this, Ellen White, commenting on this, not on the restraining of Islam, but on the events that are associated with the restraining of Islam, which was the bringing down of the towers of New York at 9/11, she talks about Revelation 18, verses 1 to 3, as being fulfilled. And we're all probably familiar with this, but you can find it in Life Sketches 411, I think it's paragraph 5. And she says that these verses were fulfilled at that time. But if you go to Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 to 3, you see two things. You see, first of all, the first angel's message, which is here, but you also see the second angel's message. And this is why, I'm just going to erase, I'll do it here, so I'll erase it. In our history, when we go from 1989 to 9/11 to the Midnight Cry to the Sunday Law, that we can directly see that this event here lines up with 9/11 because this is the first angel's message. But Ellen White says that Revelation 18, verses 1 to 3, were fulfilled at this event. And this is the first angel's message, and this is the second angel's message. And when you do that, it gives us the ability to take this waymark here and superimpose it over here, just as we do with this one. So both of these events superimpose one on top of the other. And so when we see here that we can get these characteristics and superimpose them one on top of the other, this is exactly what we're doing here. We get events here and events here. And because Ellen White says that both of these were fulfilled at this moment in history, then these characteristics and these ones combine together at 9/11. And it's this that's of interest to us, the first day of the first month. Now, in many Bible verses, it explicitly tells you that something occurs on the first day of the first month. But in other passages, it doesn't explicitly tell you what day. It just tells you the month. But when it does that, it normally gives you other clues to indicate that this is not some kind of general first month thing, that it can be applied specifically to the first day of the first month. And even a cursory reading of chapter 2 indicates to us there are enough clues in Nehemiah chapter 2 to know that this is not just the first month, but this is really relating to the first day of the first month at a prophetic level. So what we've done is this. We've gone to Nehemiah chapter 1 and chapter 2. We've seen that the 20th year begins in chapter 1, verse 1, in the 9th month, and it identifies the palace at Shushan. Because we want to identify where this is in prophetic history in Daniel chapter 8, verse 2. That's the whole objective that we want to do. We want to identify where can we place the palace at Shushan at the end of the world. Chapter 1, verse 1 identifies it here in the 20th year. But in the same year, we have the first month occurring in chapter 2, verse 1. And this first month is actually the first day of the first month, because there are other identifying features in chapter 2 to give us clues to know that it's the first day of the first month. And the logic behind all of this is all brought to view here. That 1843 would end in the spring of 1844, specifically April the 19th. That would be the first day of the first month. The first day of the first month was a crisis point in Millerite history, which led them to proclaim the second angel's message, as the first angel's message had been powered 4 years prior to that date. But Ellen White says, Life Sketches 4:11, that Revelation 18 verses 1 to 3 will be fulfilled when the towers of New York are brought down. Verse 1 is the first angel's message, verses 2 and 3 are the second angel's message. So we can combine this waymark and this waymark into a singular waymark here. And one of the waymarks about this history was that this was the first day of the first month. So here is the first day of the first month. And if we understand that 9/11 was the first day of the first month, then when we come to the book of Nehemiah and we see that chapter 2 verse 1 is occurring on the first day of the first month, and there are other characteristics in chapter 2 that help to further pinpoint this, that you know that chapter 2 verse 1 is the first day of the first month, and this is 9/11. But this is all happening in the same year. And that gives us the ability to say that this event here in chapter 2 verse 1 can be superimposed onto chapter 1 verse 1, and therefore identifying that the palace at Shushan is at 9/11. It's rather convoluted, but I hope that made sense. I can tell you a quick way of doing this. The quick way is this. If you type in on your computers, in your concordances, Shushan, Shushan means a lily. That's what Shushan means. It means lily. Lily, the flower lily. And people have observed that the shape of a lily is in the shape of a trumpet. And so if you look at the shape of a trumpet, we know that this trumpet was sounded here at 9/11, that people would identify it that way, that it says it's a lily, it doesn't call it a trumpet. It's just by a visual association that a lily looks like a trumpet, that people have inferred that maybe it's identified as the first day of the first month at 9/11. But I like the convoluted way. Any questions? Please go ahead.
So this line on the bottom right.
This one line here.
First day, first month.
Yes.
Lines up down the bottom of that second page, right?
Yes.
And then here you say it lines up 9/11.
Yes.
First section's missing.
And the first and the second. The first and the second are occurring at the same time.
And you're doing that because of Revelation 18, 1 through 3.
Revelation 18, 1 through 3. To understand just this small portion, chapter 8, verse 2, this palace of Shushan, you need a lot of background information. You need to be familiar with the reform line of the Millerites in some detail, and also the whole study in Ezra chapter 7. And the study of Ezra chapter 7 is a study of calendars. Fundamentally, it's all about calendars. And when you combine the study of the calendars that Ezra 7 shows us with the Millerite reform line, then you can see how these events, these dates that are brought to view in Ezra. Let's go to Ezra 7. We'll go to Ezra 7, and just to show you that where you can pick these things up. So in Ezra chapter 7, verse 9, "For upon the first day of the first month began he to go up from Babylon, and on the first day of the 5th month came he to Jerusalem, according to the good hand of his God upon him." So a simple verse, seems pretty benign. You wouldn't think you'd get much out of that, would you? On the first of the first month began he to go up from Babylon. So on the first of the first month, they've been held captive in Babylon, and they're going to leave Babylon. So there's a call made by Ezra and his associates to come out of Babylon, to leave Babylon. But that's the very thing that we see brought to view here, isn't it? Because they're identifying that Babylon has fallen. And if you go back into Millerite history, there was a call made out by the Millerites to those who were still in the Protestant churches to come out of Babylon. Now, it's exactly the same language that you see brought to view here. And then it says, on the first of the 5th month came he to Jerusalem according to the good hand of his God. And this is going to lead us to the midnight cry. It's here that you can see that they're going to enter Jerusalem, and when they enter Jerusalem, there's going to be a preparation time before they can enter into the Day of Atonement, the sacrifice, and the feast day that's going to happen 2 short months later. So you can see that historically this all fits in with Millerite history. And when you begin to take these dates as symbols and begin to make application. So an understanding that the second angel's message arrived in April 19th, and the reason why it arrived is because there was a final split between the Protestants and the Millerites. When that final split happened, the Millerites had finally seen the light that Protestant churches were now part of Babylon. They should separate from them. So there was a call out of Babylon, exactly what we see in Ezra. Hence we mark the second angel arriving there. And then Ellen White, in Life Sketches, she does it in a Review and Herald article as well, it's almost identical, that she combines Revelation 18:1, 2 and 3 together and say they will be fulfilled when the great buildings of New York fall. So the great buildings of New York fell at 9/11 at the same time that we see Islam being restrained, hence 1840. And because it's verses 1 to 3, the first and second angel's messages, we then get the ability to get this waymark and combine it with this waymark as we bring them into our own history. So you get these two angels that come at the same time. And that's why 9/11 would mark the first day of the first month, which brings us back to the book of Nehemiah, that the same thing is happening here in the first month with other additional information in chapter 2, which we haven't gone through. You can see that you can line this up with the first of the first month, which would be 9/11. But 9/11 is just a general comment in the book of Nehemiah until you associate chapter 2, verse 1 with chapter 1, verse 1. And the association is in this understanding here that there's this combination of two calendars. Two waymarks get superimposed one on top of the other. And that's how we understand that the Palace of Shushan is at 9/11. And we could also go into the book of Esther. The book of Esther is going to show us the same truth. So we're quickly going to Esther and then we'll close up for the evening. So in the book of Esther, chapter 1, we won't go to all the verses, but we'll go straight to verse 2. In those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, or in the reign of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus was the next king after Darius the Great. Darius the Great has converted the provincial town of Shushan into one of the royal cities. It's their winter residence, and all the kings, most of the kings, after that used that city as their winter residence, which is what Ahasuerus is doing. This is Xerxes. So they're in the palace at this moment here, this event. And then there's this contrast between verse 2 and verse 5. We can see the palace that's brought to view in verse 2, but in verse 5 it says, "And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, even 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace." So when you look at verse 2 and verse 5, you have something that's occurring in the palace, and in verse 5 you have something that's occurring in the court of the palace. So you've got something that's happening in the building and something that's happening in the court or that surrounds the building. You've got building and you've got a courtyard. Two separate things happening. If we were to turn to 2 Chronicles, chapter 29, there's a story in here. This is the story of Hezekiah. Chapter 29, 2 Chronicles. And we're just going to pick up from verses 16 and 17. And what we're going to see before we read it, we're going to see a work that's being done in the temple. And we're going to see the works done in two phases. One is in the house, and one is in the court. And we see that this is 8 days long, and this is 8 days long. But we're going to see that this work starts on the first day of the first month. And we've already identified that this is 9/11. So let's read all of that. And the priest went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it, and brought out all the uncleanness that they found in the temple of the Lord. So we'll just stop there. It says, the priest went into the inner part of the house. When it says the house here, it means the whole temple complex. It's not talking about the building, because it makes that clear in the next part of the verse, to cleanse it, and brought out all the uncleanness they found in the temple of the Lord. So they first go into the house or the temple, the building, and they clean it, and it says they bring out all the filth into the court of the house of the Lord, and the Levites took it to carry it out abroad into the brook Kidron. Now they began on the first day of the first month. So here's the first day of the first month, which we've already marked as 9/11. And on the 8th day of the month came they to the porch. So it takes 8 days to clean this building, this house. They start from the inside and they get to the porch, which is the very extent of the house. So it takes 8 days to do that. And then it says it takes another 8 days. So they sanctified the house of the Lord in 8 days, and in the 16th day of the first month they made an end. So by the time you get to here, it's all clean. So they're going to clean it, 8 days to clean the house or the temple, and then 8 days to clean the courts. So you see the distinction between the building and the courtyard, and it's the same distinction that's brought to view in the book of Esther. There are these feasts that are going on, and one of them is in the building, and then the second one is in the court. And so we can get in the book of Esther, verse 2 and verse 5, and take that structure and superimpose that over here. Now in the book of Esther, it uses the term court, but it uses the term palace. And you'll see that this is 180 days long, and this is 7 days long. But you can see it's following the same structure. Because it's following the same structure, we can get this and superimpose one on top of the other. And that would teach us that when it talks about the palace in Shushan, it's marking the first of the first month, 9/11. So here's our second witness, scriptural witness, besides all the historical events, that when we go to Daniel chapter 8, verse 2, that this is beginning at 9/11, based upon an understanding of Nehemiah and an understanding of 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and Esther chapter 1, with all, obviously, the background information of Millerite history. So it might all seem a bit esoterical all of this information, but it's of vital interest. This is really important, new light, new information that's being brought to God's people about how we get these chapters and we bring them to the end of the world. And for me, one of the things that I found I struggled a lot with it is trying to understand what the Palace of Shushan was referring to and how to understand and work out in my own mind where we would place that. And it's in the book of Esther and Nehemiah. These are the only places that you can find. And there's a lot of information in both chapters to really clearly identify that this is 9/11. And we understand the significance of 9/11 in the beginning of the threefold union to varying degrees. I know we may not all understand it, but we know that that's a significant date. And we can now show that in its reapplication, Daniel chapter 8 is really beginning at 9/11. So we'll all sleep on that, and we'll have a revision of it tomorrow, and hopefully we'll remember some of that. Let's close this prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your loving kindness and your goodness towards us. Father, we're not ignorant of the fact that this light that you're bringing to your people, many of us, many of your children, Lord, are bracing themselves against this light, and they see it as fanaticism. They see the methodology that we're using to be incorrect, to be invented by human devisings, and not as a revelation of your will. Help each of us, Lord, to trust your word, to read what you have instructed us to do, so that we might have clarity that these are not the inventions of human beings, but they're a revelation of your will. Father, these things are so important to us as we begin to understand what these visions are trying to teach us and what these visions are able to do in our own experience. We know that we should not be discounting the work of this vision, this Shazone vision, and the Moray vision, the Marah vision. Father, be with us and help us to have a clear working understanding of what they mean to us and the impact that they have upon us. We ask all these blessings, Father, in the precious name of Jesus. We ask for rest tonight. We ask for travelling mercies that we might go to our various places safely and be with us and help us to come back safely tomorrow to fellowship and worship you. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.